In the summer of 1900, the largest city in the territory of Alaska had no harbor. Ships anchored a mile offshore in the open roadstead of the Bering Sea, and passengers climbed down rope ladders into flat-bottomed lighters that slammed through the surf to deposit them, soaking wet, onto a beach where men were digging gold out of the sand with their bare hands. The city behind that beach, Nome, had a population approaching 20,000. It had more than 60 saloons. It had electric lights and a telephone exchange and a federal judge who turned out to be a crook. It had Wyatt Earp running the fanciest bar in town. It had its own newspaper, the Nome Nugget, which is still publishing today. And it had no roads leading anywhere. The only way in was by sea. The only way out was by sea. The winter ice closed the port for 8 months of the year, and anyone still in Nome when the last ship sailed was simply stuck until spring, in a place where temperatures dropped to 40 below and the sun barely rose above the horizon. Every gold rush town in American history was built on the same bet, that there was wealth in the ground, and whoever got there first would get the most. Nome was different. Even its name was an accident. The most widely repeated origin story holds that a cartographer mapping the Seward Peninsula made a notation next to an unnamed cape. Name. A later draftsman, misreading the handwriting, labeled it Cape Nome. Whether or not that story is apocryphal, it has the right feeling for a city that came into existence almost by chance. Nome was built on the most democratic deposit of gold ever found on the continent, a fortune scattered across miles of open beach, unclaimed and unclaimable, free to anyone with a shovel. It was called the poor man's paradise, and everything about the place, its speed, its violence, its corruption, its strange and almost accidental grandeur, came from that single fact. The gold was lying on the sand. You didn't need a pick. You didn't need a claim. You just needed to get off the boat. The discovery that started it all happened on September 20th, 1898, when 3 prospectors, Jaffet Lindeberg, a Norwegian, Eric Lindblom, and John Bryntesen, both Swedish-born Americans, found rich deposits of alluvial gold on Anvil Creek, a tributary of the Snake River a few miles inland from the Bering Sea coast of the Seward Peninsula. They would become known as the Three Lucky Swedes, though Lindeberg was actually Norwegian, a detail the press never bothered to correct. They had come from the Circle City mining district in Alaska's interior, following rumors that Inupiat people near the coast wore crude golden ornaments made from nuggets picked up along the shore. They staked their claims and filed their papers at St. Michael, 125 miles to the southeast, and by winter the word was out. The timing was exquisite. The Klondike Gold Rush, centered around Dawson City in the Canadian Yukon, was already winding down by 1899. Thousands of disappointed prospectors who had trekked into the interior and found every good claim already taken were sitting in Dawson, broke and bitter, when steamships arrived with news of a massive new strike on the Alaskan coast. In a single week that summer, 8,000 people abandoned Dawson City for Nome. By the end of 1899, 3,000 prospectors were working the creeks around Anvil City, as the settlement was then called, and the population had swelled to 10,000. But the creeks were finite, and by midsummer 1899, every inch of productive creek bed had been staked. Late arrivals, furious and desperate, milled around the tent city with nothing to do and no ground to work. Claim jumping was rampant. Miners who had filed legitimate claims woke to find rival stakes driven into their ground overnight. Fights broke out daily. The small military garrison was overwhelmed. And then, in July 1899, someone, whose name history does not confidently record, thought to pan the sand down at the waterline. What came up was almost impossible to believe. There was gold in the beach. Not in one spot, not in a pocket or a crevice or a hidden seam that a lucky man might stumble across. For 40 miles along the coast, from Cape Rodney to Cape Nome, the ruby-colored sand was laced with fine placer gold. It was visible in the pan on the first wash. A man could sit at the edge of the surf with a shovel, a bucket, and a simple rocking cradle and sift gold from wet sand all day long. And because the beach belonged to no one, because the tides rearranged it twice a day and no surveyor could fix a boundary on moving water, a judge ruled it could not be staked as a mining claim. It was open ground, first come, first served, all day, every day, until the sand was spent. Within weeks, 2,000 people were working the beach around the clock, shoulder to shoulder, as waves broke over their boots. That ruling turned Nome into something America had never seen before, a gold rush without gatekeepers. In the Klondike, you needed money, equipment, and the brutal physical endurance to haul a ton of supplies over the Chilkoot Pass. In California, in 1849, the early claims were sewn up within months. But at Nome, a man who arrived in June with nothing but the clothes on his back could walk to the waterline, scoop sand into a rocker, and pull out gold before sundown. During the summer of 1899, more than $2 million worth of gold was taken from the beaches, roughly $63 million in today's money, by an estimated 2,000 miners, which works out to about $1,000 per man, more than twice the average American annual wage. The news reached Seattle and San Francisco that winter, and the rush of 1900 made 1899 look like a rehearsal. Steamship companies ran advertisements that read like carnival barkers. Few men become rich by slow economy. Fortunes are made by men of nerve and decision who take advantage of opportunities. Would you like to be a millionaire? A first-class ticket from Seattle to Nome cost $100, meals and berth included, with 150 pounds of baggage allowed at no charge. By early summer, an estimated 20,000 people had landed on the beach. Tents stretched in an unbroken line for 30 miles along the coast. The 1900 census officially counted 12,488 residents. But that number, taken in the chaos of a stampede, almost certainly undercounted. Some historians put the peak population closer to 28,000. A third of Alaska's entire white population was concentrated on this one strip of treeless, harborless coast, 150 miles south of the Arctic Circle. The makeshift city that rose behind the beach was astonishing in its improvisation. Front Street, running parallel to the shoreline, became the main commercial artery, a wooden plank road lined with saloons, trading posts, hotels, restaurants, and law offices, their painted signs jostling for attention like bidders at an auction. The Gold Belt Dance Hall, the Madden House, the Reception Saloon, the Tortoni Restaurant. They appeared in weeks, built from lumber shipped in by steamship at outrageous cost because there were no trees on the Seward Peninsula large enough to mill. The planks on the streets were necessary because the permafrost beneath the surface thawed in summer and turned the ground into an impassable slurry of mud. The planks also burned easily, a problem that would revisit Nome with devastating regularity. There was no sewer system. The Snake River, running through the middle of town, functioned as an open drain. Typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia were constant companions. A man could make $50 in a day on the beach and spend all of it by nightfall on whiskey, a meal of canned beef, and a cot in a rooming house so crowded that the beds were rented in shifts. The U.S. Army, recognizing that the consent government the miners had cobbled together was wholly inadequate to manage a city this size, stepped in and assumed control. Local police forced anyone without adequate shelter to leave before winter, loading them onto the last outbound steamships. The Bering Sea mining season ran only from June to October. After that, the ice locked the coast. The ships stopped coming, and whoever was left settled in for 8 months of darkness, cold, and waiting. Into this gorgeous chaos stepped Wyatt Earp. He was 51 years old, nearly 2 decades removed from the gunfight at the OK Corral, and he had spent the intervening years doing what he always did, following money from one boomtown to the next. He had refereed prize fights in San Francisco, speculated in San Diego real estate, and run saloons and gambling houses across the West. He arrived in Nome in the summer of 1899 with his common-law wife, Josephine, after being stranded for a winter in the tiny settlement of Rampart when the Yukon River froze. His friend Tex Rickard, who would later become the most famous boxing promoter in America, the man who built Madison Square Garden, was already running a saloon in Nome and had written to Earp dismissing his modest income selling beer and cigars in St. Michael as chicken feed. Earp and his partner, Charles Hoxie, built the Dexter Saloon on Front Street that fall. It was Nome's first two-story wooden building and, by a wide margin, its most luxurious drinking establishment. The Dexter advertised itself, with characteristic frontier irony, as the only second-class saloon in Alaska, a joke that meant it was too classy for the common drunks and too rowdy for the respectable. The interior was decorated with furnishings that Earp and Josephine brought back from California during the winters. The couple preferred to spend the dark months in Los Angeles, often staying at the swank Hollenbeck Hotel, and returned each spring on the first available steamer with luxurious accessories for the bar. Earp paid $1,500 for a liquor license, about $50,000 today, and the investment paid for itself almost immediately. The Dexter drew anyone famous who passed through Nome: the novelist Jack London, the writer Rex Beach, the playwright Wilson Meisner, boxing promoter Rickard, and Earp's old friend John Clum, the former mayor of Tombstone and Arizona newspaperman who had given the gunslinger favorable publicity in his Tombstone days. There is a photograph of the two of them together in Nome, posed like old soldiers at a reunion, which, in a sense, they were. Earp himself said he had come to Nome to mine the miners, and he was as good as his word. The Dexter's poker chips, hand-carved bone, octagonal, stamped with the saloon's name, came in denominations of $25, $50, and $100. A $100 chip at the Dexter represented more than 3 months' wages for an ordinary American worker. The chips are collector's items today, selling for over $1,000 at auction. By the time he sold his share of the Dexter and left Alaska in the fall of 1901, he walked away with $80,000, more than $3 million in today's money. He and Josephine promptly lost most of it gambling and making bad loans to family, a pattern so consistent in Earp's life it amounted to a personal economic policy. The Dexter competed for trade with more than 60 other saloons. Where Earp's place stood, Nome City Hall sits today. There is a small monument to him there, next to another marker indicating the former location of the red light district. In its heyday, Nome had 75 bars and 2 churches. Today it has 9 bars and 13 churches. Draw your own conclusions. While Earp was pouring drinks and raking in profits, Nome was enduring one of the most brazen acts of judicial corruption in American history. Alexander Mackenzie, known as Big Alex, was a former frontier sheriff who had become the Republican political boss of North Dakota, a maker of senators, a man with personal connections to the White House and to the nation's most powerful business magnates. When he heard about the gold at Nome, he saw not a mining opportunity, but a financial engineering opportunity of breathtaking audacity. His plan was to use the federal court system to seize the richest claims, deposit the gold in a shell company, and issue stock on Wall Street, with Big Alex unloading his shares on unsuspecting public buyers while keeping a secret trust of additional shares for his political friends. It was a corporate takeover, except the corporation was a gold field, and the hostile act was committed with a judge's gavel. In 1900, Mackenzie secured the appointment of Arthur Noyes, a crony from the Dakota Territories, as the first federal district judge for the Nome region, possibly, according to some accounts, through bribes paid to members of the U.S. Senate. Mackenzie then traveled to Nome aboard the same steamship as the new judge, the steamer Senator, arriving on July 19, 1900. For the miners of Nome, who had been living under a system of chaotic self-governance and more than 50 saloons worth of lawlessness, the arrival of a federal judge seemed like a promise of order. It was anything but. Within days, Noyes issued orders stripping the richest mining claims on Anvil Creek from their rightful owners, including claims belonging to the Three Lucky Swedes, and appointing Mackenzie as the legal receiver to operate the mines while the owners appealed. This was not a gray area of law. It was theft in judicial robes. Mackenzie immediately began mining the claims and extracting gold for himself. The original owners, unable to get justice from Noyes, took their case to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco, 2,000 miles away. The appeals court reversed the judge and ordered Mackenzie to stop mining and return the gold. Mackenzie ignored the order. He simply kept digging. The Ninth Circuit, astonished by the defiance, sent U.S. Marshals to Nome to arrest him. Mackenzie was hauled back to San Francisco, found guilty of contempt of court, and sentenced to a year in prison. He served 3 months. President William McKinley pardoned him. Noyes was found guilty of contempt, fined $1,000, and removed from the bench. He went back to Wisconsin and died in obscurity. Mackenzie went back to North Dakota, diminished but not destroyed, and died in 1922. The whole affair became the basis for Rex Beach's 1906 novel, The Spoilers, which was adapted into a stage play, and then 5 separate Hollywood films, 2 of them starring John Wayne. The story was so outrageous, so perfectly American in its blend of frontier audacity and Gilded Age corruption, that it kept getting retold for half a century. Beach had sat in Earp's Dexter saloon and watched the whole thing unfold. By 1905, Nome had settled into something approaching a real city, smaller than its frenzied peak, but more solidly built and more genuinely livable. It had a hospital, Holy Cross, and several churches, including St. Joseph's Catholic Church, built in 1901, which would prove to be one of the most durable structures in the city's history. It had schools and a proper courthouse. It had a post office that in the summer of 1900 had been the largest general delivery address in the entire U.S. postal system. Clerks needed 5 separate filing boxes just for letters addressed to people named Johnson. It had the first wireless telegraph in Alaska, capable of transmitting more than 100 miles, relaying messages to St. Michael and onward to Seattle. Some of the earliest automobiles in the territory were clattering over the plank streets of Front Street, dodging dog teams and horse-drawn wagons. A hothouse, built on a sand spit across the Snake River, grew fresh vegetables in a place where the growing season lasted about 10 weeks. There was a formal electric light plant and a telephone exchange. There were multiple newspapers competing for readers. The Pioneer Mining Company, founded by the Three Lucky Swedes, was on its way to earning $20 million, $250 million in today's money, making Lindeberg, the Norwegian who was called a Swede, one of the wealthiest men in the territory. The Loman family had arrived in that first wave. G.J. Loman, a lawyer from St. Paul, Minnesota, and his son Carl came in 1900, and by 1903 the rest of the family had followed. Carl's mother, his sister Helen, and his brothers Ralph, Harry, and Alfred. The Lomans bought a photography studio in 1908, a drugstore in 1909, and eventually built a reindeer corporation that shipped meat to the lower 48 states. Alfred became the primary photographer, documenting everything: the mining operations, the dog sled teams, the Inupiat communities, the street scenes of Front Street in winter under banks of snow 7 feet high. The Loman photographs would become the most important visual record of Nome's existence. That they survived at all is a matter of partial luck and considerable heartbreak, as we will see. And then, because nothing in Nome could happen at a normal pace, the city invented long-distance sled dog racing. In 1907, a group of men gathered around a stove in a Nome saloon, likely the Board of Trade, where the Nome Kennel Club had been founded, and started arguing about whose dogs were fastest. Scotty Allen, one of the most popular mushers in town, later recalled the origin with typical Alaskan understatement. On a cold spring day in 1907, a group of us gathered around the stove in a Nome saloon and began talking about dog races. After a few weeks of arguing, we worked out the rules of the All-Alaska Sweepstakes. The race they designed was 408 miles, from Nome to the settlement of Candle on the north side of the Seward Peninsula and back, following the telegraph lines that connected the mining camps and villages. The telegraph was the key. It allowed progress reports to be wired back to Nome in real time, and those reports were posted in the saloons, where the betting was constant, informed, and ruinous. The first race, held in April 1908, was won by John Hegness, driving a team owned by a lawyer named Albert Fink, in 119 hours, 15 minutes, and 12 seconds. Hegness reportedly collected a $10,000 purse, more than $250,000 in today's money. The second-place musher, Scotty Allen, finished less than an hour behind, a margin close enough on a 408-mile course to guarantee that every man in Nome would be back at the Board of Trade placing bets the following year. The race ran every spring from 1908 to 1917, and it made celebrities of its champions. Allen and Leonard Sapala each won 3 times. Sapala introduced Siberian Huskies to the course in 1910, lighter and faster than the Alaskan Malamutes that had been the standard, and permanently changed the breed composition of racing teams across the territory. Fink, the owner of the first winning team, went on to serve as the defense attorney in 2 of the most famous trials in American history, the bribery case of Illinois Senator William Lorimer and the tax evasion prosecution of Al Capone. Nome had a way of producing people who ended up at the center of things. But the gold was running out. Gold production on the Seward Peninsula peaked in 1906, and the easy beach gold had been largely exhausted years before that. Between 1899 and 1910, miners pulled more than $46 million worth of gold from the Nome district, the equivalent of roughly $1.5 billion today. The district had also produced the second largest gold nugget ever found in Alaska, a 182 troy-ounce monster hauled out of Anvil Creek, nearly 15 pounds of solid gold. But the curve was bending inexorably downward. The mining of Nome Beach had followed a textbook progression. First the pan, then the rocker, then the sluice box, then the horse-drawn equipment, then the steam-powered pump, and finally the massive bucket dredge chewing through sand and gravel that no individual miner could profitably work by hand. The first large dredge, the Wisconsin, appeared on the Snake River as early as 1901. By 1905, independent prospecting was essentially over. The poor man's paradise had become a corporate operation, and corporations don't need 20,000 employees on a beach. By 1909, the population had plummeted from its peak to around 2,600. The census told the story in cold numbers. The people who had come for gold left when the gold got hard to reach. The steamships that had once arrived packed with stampeders now sailed half empty. Workers on the creeks had once earned as much as $11 a day, 3 times the going rate in the lower states. But even those wages couldn't hold men in a place where the nearest city was a 1,000-mile sea voyage away, and winter lasted 8 months. Nome did not die. It contracted painfully into a smaller and quieter version of itself, sustained by the big mining companies, the government wireless station, the Coast Guard life-saving station at the mouth of the Snake River, and the Inupiat communities that had been there for centuries before any Swede found gold on Anvil Creek. The population drifted between 1,000 and 2,000. The saloons thinned out. The dance halls closed. But the city's relationship with catastrophe was far from over. On October 6, 1913, a Bering Sea storm of extraordinary violence slammed into Nome. The city had no breakwater, no seawall, no protection of any kind from the open ocean that sat a few hundred yards from Front Street. Without warning, a massive wave swept the backs of the buildings on the south side of Front Street, breaking them apart from behind. The water rushed under buildings, lifted floors into the air, and dropped them again until they shattered. A Chinese laundryman, hoping to keep his floor in place, weighted it down with large rocks. The next wave hurled the floor, rocks and all, high into the air. The electric superintendent and his crew rode through the dangerous streets all night, frantically repairing downed lines, knowing that a single spark in the high wind could mean fire and total destruction. The east end of town and much of the business district were wrecked. Buildings from the Pacific Packing and Navigation Company, the Board of Trade, the John J. Cessnan Company, and dozens of other businesses lay in ruins along Front Street. The Snake River Bridge was destroyed. It was Nome's most destructive storm on record at the time. The city rebuilt because that is what Nome did. It rebuilt on the same sand, in the same path of the same storms, with the same wooden buildings, because there was no alternative material available, and because the people who remained were the ones stubborn enough to stay. But the recovery was slow, and history did not cooperate. The First World War drained Alaska of manpower and capital. Gold production in Nome fell by more than 2/3 between 1916 and 1918, not because the gold was gone, but because the men and the money had gone elsewhere. The All-Alaska Sweepstakes ran its last race in 1917, a casualty of the same contraction. By the early 1920s, Nome was a town of perhaps 1,500 souls. Its Front Street quieter than it had been at any point since the Three Lucky Swedes waded into Anvil Creek. A Princeton historian who later studied photographs of this period called the city mostly stagnant. The Loman brothers kept their camera shutters clicking, documenting a town that seemed to be slowly, uneventfully fading from the American story. Then, in January 1925, Nome's isolation, the quality that had always defined it, that made it simultaneously magnificent and impossible, became a matter of life and death. Dr. Curtis Welch, the only physician in town, serving Nome and the surrounding communities with 4 nurses from the small Maynard Columbus Hospital, diagnosed cases of diphtheria, a highly contagious bacterial disease that was particularly lethal to children and to the Inupiat population who had no natural resistance. He had ordered fresh antitoxin months earlier, but it had never arrived, and his existing supply, more than 6 years old, had expired. The nearest serum was in Anchorage, nearly 1,000 miles away. The port was icebound. The single aircraft in the region had been dismantled for the winter, its open cockpit no match for the Arctic storms in any case. The only option was the oldest technology available: dog sleds. Welch sent a message by radio telegraph. An epidemic of diphtheria is almost inevitable here. I am in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. What followed was the Great Race of Mercy, a relay of 20 mushers and roughly 150 sled dogs, carrying 300,000 units of diphtheria antitoxin 674 miles from Nenana, where the railroad ended, to Nome. The relay was completed in 5.5 days, in temperatures that dropped to 56 degrees below zero, through blizzards that reduced visibility to nothing. Leonard Sapala, the champion of the All-Alaska Sweepstakes, drove the longest and most dangerous leg, 261 miles, with his lead dog, Togo. But it was Gunnar Kossin, driving the final 53-mile stretch with a Siberian husky named Balto in the lead, who arrived in Nome at 5:30 in the morning on February 2nd, 1925, and became famous. The story made front-page news across America. Radio, just becoming a household medium, carried dispatches from Nome to millions of listeners. Balto became the most celebrated dog in the country after Rin Tin Tin. A bronze statue of him was unveiled in Central Park that December, where it still stands. Sapala, who had covered 5 times the distance Kossin had, and whose dog Togo had navigated the most treacherous terrain, spent the rest of his life quietly angry about the misallocation of credit. The official death toll in Nome was listed as 5, or 6, or 7. The records are uncertain. But Dr. Welch estimated there were probably at least 100 additional cases among Inupiat communities outside the city whose children were buried without the deaths being reported. The serum run gave Nome a second kind of fame, distinct from the gold rush. It also planted the seed for the Iditarod Trail sled dog race, which would begin in 1973 and make Nome's Front Street the most famous finish line in mushing. But in 1925, the Serum Run was not a beginning. It was a reminder that Nome was a city so isolated, so far beyond the reach of modern infrastructure, that saving its children from a common disease required a method of transportation that predated the internal combustion engine by several thousand years. 9 years later, Nome burned. On the morning of September 17, 1934, a spark from a chimney landed on the roof of the Golden Gate Hotel on Front Street. A 34-mile-per-hour wind caught the flames and pushed them from building to building. The fire spread with sickening speed through the wooden commercial district. George Maynard, the publisher of the Nome Nugget, scrambled to save his printing equipment as the roof of his newsroom buckled above him. His son Russ ran back into the burning building to rescue parts of the presses. Ralph Loman of the Loman brothers, the family that had run a photography studio, a drugstore, a reindeer corporation, and half the commerce of Nome for 3 decades, stood on Front Street and watched the Golden Gate Hotel collapse. By nightfall, nearly every building in Nome was destroyed. 65 businesses, 90 homes, the Loman Brothers photography studio and its 25 to 30,000 glass plate negatives documenting 3 decades of Nome life, all of it gone. The fire had carved a smoldering path 10 blocks long and 3 blocks wide through the heart of the city. Only the government wireless station, which sent out the bad news, one hotel, a hospital, and a Loman warehouse on the north side of the street survived. The entire winter food supply was destroyed. That night, the temperature dropped to 38 degrees. The Chicago Daily Tribune ran the headline, "Fire Destroys Nome, Alaska, Gold Rush City." It read less like news than like an obituary. With the Arctic winter less than a month away, most of the town's remaining 1,500 residents had to be evacuated. A fleet of ships, including the Coast Guard cutter Northland, was dispatched to carry people south. The Coast Guard life-saving station at the Snake River, the same station that had been serving Nome since 1906, its crew rowing through Bering Sea surf, driving dog sleds in 40-below winters, and fighting fires with equipment that was never adequate, lost its own boathouse and barracks to the blaze, rendering it inoperable. The station keeper, Chief Warrant Officer Thomas Ross, boarded the last ship to Seattle with his wife and daughter in November, leaving a skeleton crew of 3 men behind. The Alaska Steamship Company, knowing it could make only 2 more round trips before the ice closed the port, cut its rates on food and building materials in half. Federal Relief Administrator Harry Hopkins, the same man running much of the New Deal from Washington, authorized $50,000 for Nome's reconstruction. Carl Loman, who had married the daughter of Andrew Volstead, the congressman who authored Prohibition, went to Washington to lobby for his city. A Loman boat that happened to be passing down the coast with a load of reindeer meat bound for Seattle was diverted to feed the survivors. St. Joseph's Catholic Church, built in 1901, was one of the few structures to survive the fire. It still stands today, moved to Anvil City Square in 1996, one of the last physical links to the original city. What the fire destroyed was not just buildings. It destroyed the physical record of Nome's golden age. The Loman negatives, the newspaper archives, the saloon interiors and hotel lobbies and street scenes that had documented a city unlike any other in North America. Only about 3,000 negatives were salvaged. The Lomans never reopened their studio. Within a decade, the entire family had moved to Seattle. Nome rebuilt again, smaller and more modestly, with money from the federal government and the grim determination of the people who had nowhere else to go. During the Second World War, the town served as the last American stop on the Lend-Lease route, ferrying aircraft from the United States to the Soviet Union across the Bering Strait. That gave it a brief wartime purpose, a new set of buildings, and a military airfield. After the war, it settled into what it has been ever since, a remote Alaskan community of a few thousand people, predominantly Inupiat, accessible only by air or sea, serving as the regional hub for 15 smaller communities across the Bering Strait region. Today, about 3,800 people live in Nome, predominantly Inupiat. The town has no road connection to the rest of Alaska. The nearest highway ends 200 miles away. Supplies arrive by barge in summer and by air year-round. Front Street has been widened and paved. None of the original Gold Rush buildings remain on the main drag. The Discovery Saloon, built in 1899 by Japhet Lindeberg, one of the Three Lucky Swedes, still stands on First Avenue, a few blocks away, one of the few Gold Rush-era structures to survive the fires and storms. The Board of Trade, once reportedly listed as one of the roughest bars in the world, operates in a newer wooden building and bills itself as headquarters for the Sin City of Nome. The Nome Nugget, the newspaper George Maynard nearly died saving in 1934, is still publishing, Alaska's oldest newspaper, still watching the same stretch of coastline. On Front Street, shop signs still advertise gold-buying services. The Oxford Assaying and Refining Corporation operates from a shack on a side street. Serving Nome miners since 1980, we buy gold. Miners still work the creeks. Offshore dredges still scour the Bering Sea floor. The total production of the Nome mining district stands at more than 3.6 million troy ounces, over 100 metric tons of gold pulled from the sand and gravel of a place with no harbor and no roads. Every March, the Iditarod Trail sled dog race ends on Front Street, a burled spruce arch. The second one, the first having rotted apart after the 1999 race, marks the finish line. The city's fire siren sounds when each musher hits the 2-mile mark. Crowds line the fenced-off stretch of the street that once held Wyatt Earp's Dexter Saloon and the Golden Gate Hotel and 60 other saloons and the offices of the Nome Nugget and the studio of the Loman brothers. The mushers pass under the arch and into the record books, finishing a race that exists because of a desperate relay to save children from diphtheria in a town so isolated it could not be reached by any other means. The whole tradition, the race, the arch, the siren, the finish chute on Front Street, is an elaborate memorial to the fact that Nome has always been, in some fundamental sense, unreachable. Anvil Creek still runs into the Snake River a few miles north of town. The original claim sites of the Three Lucky Swedes are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The beach extends in both directions from what is left of the city. The same beach where, in the summer of 1899, a man could walk down to the waterline and pull gold from the sand without owning an inch of ground. The sand is darker than you might expect, reddish, almost ruby-colored in certain light. The Bering Sea comes in and goes out, as it has for 10,000 years, rearranging the beach with every tide. The gold that the sea brought in, it never quite finished taking back.